I was standing in the middle of my own 40th wedding anniversary celebration, watching red wine run down the lapel of my suit. Not because someone bumped into me by accident, but because my son had just thrown it straight at me, and at my wife, right there, in front of friends, business partners, and people who used to call me a model father. He said I was selfish, because I refused to buy him a supercar, and in that moment I realized something painful. There are moments when a family can break apart, in just a few seconds of silence. Before I go on, if this story made you pause, even for a moment, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Every follow and every share is the reason I'm able to tell this story all the way through. Now, let me take you back to the moment when all of this began. I stood there for a long time after that moment. Not because I was stunned, but because an old question surfaced in my mind. One I thought I had answered years ago. Where did I go wrong? This suit jacket. I've worn it to many important occasions. Grand openings, contract signings, dinners where people shook my hand and said, "Michael, the man who builds the future." I can't remember ever spilling wine on it, not once. Yet tonight, that red stain stood out painfully clear, like a marker that could never be erased. Jennifer and I had prepared for this celebration for months, not to show off, but to close a chapter. 40 years of marriage, 40 years of paying off loans together, waking up early together, and staying silent together when silence was needed. I was never someone who got rich fast. I moved slowly, too slowly, in Brandon's eyes. In 40 years as an architect, I never had a lucky break. No sudden fortune, just blueprints, endless meetings, projects rejected and rebuilt. I saved every dollar, not because I was cheap, but because I understood something simple. Freedom in old age is built from discipline in youth. When I retired, Jennifer and I had assets worth about $2.5 million. Not a shocking number, but enough for us to sleep peacefully. A house overlooking the ocean, a few stable investments, a retirement fund that depended on no one. I once believed that was the greatest gift I could give my son, a living example of independence. But Brandon saw those numbers differently. He arrived at the party in a new suit, a shining watch, and that familiar smile. From the outside, anyone would think my son was doing very well. Few people knew the car he drove there was borrowed. Those luxury check-in vacations were paid with credit cards, and the bills were stacked neatly in a drawer I was never allowed to open. Jennifer noticed long before I did. She's more perceptive than me. She noticed how Brandon avoided specific questions, how Ashley always answered for him. I kept telling myself, my son would grow up eventually. Ashley entered our family with grace. She wasn't loud. She didn't create conflict. On the contrary, she always said things that sounded right. Our family should look the part. Personal branding matters, especially for your son. At first, those words sounded like advice, but month by month, I saw the gloss around Brandon grow thicker. Not built on ability, but on image. An image I never created, yet one people assumed I was funding. A few weeks before the party, Ashley invited me out for coffee. She chose a cafe facing the ocean. She talked about status, about how society looks at you, and finally, about a supercar, a name I never expected to hear in my life. McLaren, priced at nearly $400,000. She said Brandon needed it to match his father's reputation. I didn't answer right away. I just looked out at the sea. I thought about the years I drove an old car, about the times I refused to buy a new watch so I could pay my employees on time. I told myself it was just a passing idea, a luxury dream that would fade on its own. I was wrong. Tonight's party was beautifully done. Malibu at sunset has a way of softening people. Old friends, old partners, people who had walked through many projects with me. They raised their glasses. They spoke about endurance, about family, about lasting values. Brandon and Ashley raised their glasses too. They gave us a framed family photo, a small gift, just enough to make everyone smile. I remember thinking, maybe I had worried for nothing. But deep down, something felt off, as if this celebration didn't belong entirely to Jennifer and me, as if something was being waited for, a moment I hadn't prepared myself to face. And I had no idea that just minutes later, everything I believed about family, about sacrifice, and about how to raise a child would begin to crack, right there between clinking glasses and polite applause. The music in the restaurant softened just enough for conversations to grow louder. I looked around the room and saw familiar faces. Faces that had aged alongside me. Some of them had stayed up all night with me fixing blueprints. Some had watched me walk away from a major project simply because the terms weren't transparent. They weren't here for a fancy dinner. They were here because of relationships built over time. Jennifer sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on mine. The gesture was so familiar that I almost forgot how much it mattered. 40 years. We learn not to say much when surrounded by people. Our silence was never empty. It always had a reason. Brandon stood up just as the main course was served. I knew the moment had arrived. Not by instinct, but by the way Ashley gave him a small nod. Quick, subtle, so slight that anyone not watching closely would think it meant nothing. Brandon raised his glass, wearing the smile I'd seen so many times in photos online. He started with the usual words, about family gratitude, about a childhood that was fully provided for. People listened. So did I. But I listened with a caution I didn't like feeling. Then Ashley placed her hand on her stomach. The room went quiet for a brief beat, just long enough for Brandon to continue, his voice lifting slightly. They were expecting a child. A grandson, he said, looking straight at me. Applause followed. Jennifer turned toward me, her expression caught between joy and confusion. I smiled, politely, the way a future grandfather is supposed to smile. I congratulated them. I said the right words. But inside my head, something heavy settled in, as if a door had just closed before I had a chance to see what was behind it. Brandon went on. He talked about new responsibilities, about preparing for the future. Ashley added her part gently. She spoke about security, about family image, about how a child born into a respected family grows up more confident. The words were carefully arranged, not rushed, not forced, but they all pointed to one place, like a blueprint finished long before tonight. I started noticing the looks from a few guests. Curious, expectant, not because they were involved, but because they thought this was a warm family moment. I didn't blame them. From the outside, everything made perfect sense. Brandon placed the framed family photo on the table in front of Jennifer and me. Printed nicely. Light wooden frame, just formal enough. He called it an anniversary gift. I thanked him. I truly did. But I also understood this was only the opening. When Brandon mentioned the car, he didn't say the name at first. He talked about a vehicle that fits the status, something safe, something that showed stability. Ashley followed, emphasizing that it was an investment in the family image, especially with a new baby on the way. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I let them finish. Over the years, I learned something important. People reveal the most when they aren't cut off. Then the name was spoken. Clearly. Directly. So was the price. No one hid it. No one hesitated. It was all laid out on the table, as if it were obvious. Brandon looked at me, waiting. Ashley leaned in slightly, her eyes soft yet firm. I understood the unspoken message. This wasn't just a request, it was a test. In front of everyone. I thought about the vacation home Jennifer and I spent years paying off. I thought about the retirement fund built step by step. I thought about the quiet mornings we looked forward to after retiring, and I realized something painful. To my son, those things were no longer achievements. They were simply resources. The air in the room grew heavier. I felt Jennifer gently squeeze my hand. Not to push me, but to remind me she was there. I took a slow breath. I knew that whatever I said next, this celebration would never feel the same. Brandon was still standing there. He smiled, but beneath it was a restlessness he couldn't hide. He thought this was the right moment, that in front of my friends and business partners I wouldn't be able to say no. He might have been right about others, but not about me. I set my glass down. Without a sound, I looked around the room one more time. These people came to celebrate 40 years of marriage, not to witness a negotiation. And I knew, in just a few minutes, that misunderstanding would be exposed. I lifted my eyes to my son, and for the first time that night, I stopped trying to keep everything looking perfect. I didn't stand up right away. I didn't raise my glass either. I just spoke, slowly, clearly enough for the people near our table to hear. I said I was happy for the news they had just shared. I said a child needs stability, not expensive symbols. And I said very plainly that I would not sell anything meant for Jennifer's and my old age to buy a luxury item for anyone. The atmosphere in the room shifted almost instantly. No one spoke. Even the soft clinking of forks against plates stopped. Brandon looked at me as if I had torn apart a script that had already been written. Ashley stayed seated, but her eyes were no longer gentle. They turned sharp and heavy, like a question that didn't need an answer. I continued without long explanations. I said Brandon was an adult. I said if he wanted something, he needed to build his own path. I said money is not proof of love, and love cannot be used as a condition. Ashley began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. Tears fell at just the right moment, enough to make a few people turn toward me with uncomfortable looks. She said I was cold. She said I clung to numbers and forgot about people. She mentioned the baby, responsibility, family. Brandon didn't stop her. He stood there, letting everything move in a direction that favored him. I looked at my son and realized something painful. He had grown used to letting others speak for him, cry for him, apply pressure for him. Jennifer placed her hand on the table. She didn't say a word, but I saw her shoulders tense slightly. I knew she was holding herself together. So was I. I didn't argue with Ashley. I only said in a calm, low voice that no one has the right to force someone else to pay for their choices. That sentence was a spark. Brandon let out a quiet laugh, not a happy one. He said I had embarrassed him. He said I was controlling, always putting principles above feelings. And then in front of everyone, he said, I would rather keep my money than keep my family. I didn't notice when the wine glass in his hand was raised. I only saw the red spill out. Fast, cold. It splashed onto my jacket, onto Jennifer's sleeve. Not much, but enough to make people jump to their feet. There was no screaming, just a rough, bitter line thrown at us, that we could hold on to our money if that was the only thing we truly valued. In that moment, I didn't feel anger the way people expect. I didn't shake. I wasn't stunned. I just felt a clean break, like a rope pulled too tight for too long, and finally let go. Jennifer stood up before I did. She took a napkin and gently wiped my sleeve. That simple gesture quieted the room more than any shouting ever could. I looked at my son, not with the eyes of a disappointed father, but of someone who had just realized he was speaking to a stranger. I apologized to our guests. I said the evening would end early. I said no one needed to witness anything more. No one objected. They understood. They packed up quietly. They left quietly, taking with them their discomfort and unanswered questions. Brandon was still standing there. Ashley leaned against him, her face still wet with tears. I didn't say another word to either of them. I knew that if I spoke then, everything would only get worse. I chose silence. Not as punishment, but to preserve the last piece of dignity I had left. When only the restaurant staff remained, I finally looked down at the stain on my jacket. The dark red had soaked into the fabric. I thought about the years I taught Brandon how to keep his word, how to take responsibility, how to stand on his own. And I wondered at what point those lessons disappeared. We left in silence. In the car, Jennifer didn't speak. Neither did I. Malibu at night is beautiful, but I saw nothing but dark shapes reflected in the window. I knew this evening didn't just end a party. It closed an illusion I had carried for far too long. And I also knew that from the moment the wine touched our clothes, nothing could ever return to the way it was before. Not because the stain couldn't be cleaned, but because some actions once taken force you to choose again how you protect the life you have left. That night I didn't sleep. Not because I was angry, but because of something harder to name. It felt like I had set down a heavy burden, and at the same time opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through. Jennifer lay beside me, breathing evenly. I knew she wasn't truly asleep either. 40 years together is long enough to understand what each other's silence means. The next morning I started with very small things. I changed my clothes. I made coffee. I sat down at the old desk I kept, even after retiring. I wasn't in a rush. I've never been someone who acts on impulse. Every building I ever designed began with rechecking the foundation, even when others believed it was already solid. I reopened our financial files, not out of suspicion, but because I needed to see everything with a clearer head. That's when I noticed something unusual, a notification from the bank about a request to reassess the value of the house we live in. It wasn't my request, and it wasn't Jennifer's. I made a call. I asked questions. I listened. Every answer was polite, proper, by the book. But together they formed a picture that kept me sitting still for a long time. Someone had tried to use my signature to open a financial door I had never agreed to unlock. I didn't get angry. Honestly, I felt cold. A familiar kind of cold I used to feel when discovering a structural flaw in a building nearly finished. That kind of flaw isn't loud, but if it's ignored, it brings everything down. I met with my lawyer that afternoon, a man who has worked with me for years, long enough to know I don't come looking for trouble. I showed him the documents. He didn't seem surprised. He simply said slowly that I needed to protect myself before things went any further. I followed his advice, not to retaliate, but to close doors I had left open for too long. I revoked the secondary credit cards under Brandon's name. I reviewed access rights to our assets, and then another truth surfaced. So clear I couldn't ignore it. The penthouse Brandon was living in, the place he often called my home, was still legally owned by my company. I had left him there as a stepping stone, a place to begin. Over time, it turned into something else. A false support, where Brandon came to believe everything was an automatic entitlement. I signed the necessary papers. No shaking hands. No hesitation. I asked Brandon to step away from the position at my old architecture firm, where he only appeared when he needed a title. I wasn't firing an employee. I was ending a pretense I had allowed for far too long. Jennifer knew what I was doing. She didn't object. She only asked if I was sure. I said yes. And I told her this. If we didn't do it now, we would pay for it with the remaining years of our lives. Brandon came that evening. No call ahead. No gentle knock. The pounding on the door was sharp and relentless, shattering the quiet we had just begun to reclaim. Ashley stood behind him, her face tense, her eyes stripped of any remaining grace. Brandon said I had betrayed him. He said I was destroying the family. He talked about the baby, the future, everything I owed him. I didn't interrupt. I let him finish. I've listened to more difficult clients than this. When he threatened that we would never see the child, I looked straight into my son's eyes. No anger, no challenge, just a vast emptiness, where the bare minimum of respect should have been. I said I wouldn't argue. I said that from now on, everything would go through lawyers. I said my door would always be open for calm conversations, but it would close to any form of threat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Brandon stormed out. Ashley turned back for one last look. In her eyes, I didn't see regret. I only saw calculations that hadn't been finished yet. I closed the door. It shut softly. But I knew. For them, it sounded very loud. That night, I wrote everything down. Not to build a case for anyone else, but to remind myself that I hadn't imagined what happened, that these boundaries were necessary, that kindness without limits becomes an invitation to be overrun. I sat in the living room looking around the home Jennifer and I built from the very beginning. I didn't feel as empty as I had feared. Instead, I felt clearer than ever. Sometimes to preserve what remains whole in a family, you have to accept that a relationship can no longer continue as it once did. And I understood this much. What I had just done was not an ending. It was only the first step toward a truth still waiting to be fully revealed. After that night, the house returned to its familiar, quiet rhythm. No more constant phone vibrations. No more subtle reminders of obligation. Jennifer and I slowed down, as if our bodies needed time to adjust to a space that had just been cleared. I didn't feel joy. I simply felt lighter. Still, there were questions I couldn't ignore. Not to accuse anyone, but to protect myself. A small detail from something Ashley once said kept looping in my mind. Vague but persistent enough to make me stop. I didn't share it with Jennifer right away. I chose to handle things quietly. By the book, without emotion. The results came a few weeks later. No noise. No drama. Just a thin stack of papers on my desk, confirming a truth I had already prepared myself to face. Brandon was not the father of the child they had used to pressure us. There was no collapse. Just a long pause. Long enough for me to know I had done the right thing by stopping when I did. I handed the papers to my lawyer. No extra words. I didn't call Brandon. I didn't look for Ashley. Truth, once it's clear, doesn't need to be thrown at anyone to prove a point. It stands on its own. The news spread in a very ordinary way, not through confrontation, but through what followed next. Ashley left. Brandon lost the last support he had assumed would always be there. I heard fragments from mutual acquaintances. I didn't confirm them. I didn't deny them either. I felt no satisfaction, only a quiet sadness for someone who never learned how to stand on his own feet. Jennifer asked me if it hurt. I said yes. But it wasn't the pain of betrayal. It was the pain of a father who realized he had held the umbrella for too long, so long that his child forgot how to walk in the rain. We decided to sell the big house. Not out of fear, but because we didn't want those walls to keep holding heavy memories. The sale happened quickly. We chose a smaller place. Enough sunlight, enough quiet, a home not tied to misplaced expectations. I used part of the money to do something I had promised myself years ago. I set up a small scholarship fund for architecture students who lacked financial support. No name, no plaque, just a few young people each year able to continue their education without drowning in debt. I wanted the values I believed in to move forward in the quietest way possible. Jennifer and I began to travel, not luxury trips, just places we had postponed for years because of work, because of responsibility. We relearned how to sit together in silence without feeling empty, how to listen to the ocean without thinking about tomorrow. One afternoon in Malibu, I held a glass of wine and watched the water reflect the late sunlight. I remembered that moment years ago, the spilled wine, and I noticed the difference, not in color, but in feeling. This time I drank to enjoy, not to endure. I don't hate Brandon. I'm not waiting for an apology. I understand that some lessons only arrive when there's no one left standing behind you. If one day he finds his own path, I'll listen. And if he doesn't, I'll still live the rest of my life fully and honestly. Legacy, I've learned, isn't about what you hand over. It's about the boundaries you set at the right time. About having the courage to say no when saying yes only pushes everything further out of balance. Love is not permanent shelter. Sometimes love is stepping aside so someone else can finally see themselves clearly in the mirror. The ocean is still there, quiet, unjudging. I set my glass down and take a slow breath. Life after everything goes on. And this time I walk forward with a calm it took me a very long time to find. If you've stayed with this story until now, thank you for giving me your time. If you saw a part of yourself in it, please like, subscribe, and share it with the people you care about. Not to judge anyone, but to remind one another that family should be built on respect, not on pressure or expectation. The lesson I took from all this is simple. Love isn't giving everything away. It's knowing when to stop. The true value of a family isn't found in money or outward appearances, but in how each person learns to take responsibility for their own life. Thank you for listening. I wish you and your family peace. Before anything goes too far.